and welcome everyone. Okay, this is a Walk, Listen, Create Walking Writers Salon. But what we have in front of us is we have Corinne Fowler and Richard White. So let me just introduce Richard to you. Richard is a UK-based walking and multimedia artist. He devises, curates and hosts walks involving listening, sensing, making and asking questions. His participatory performative practice, Walk Now, explores accountability and seeks to develop responsibilities through iterations of walking with approach. Richard's critical walking art practices and process is for social justice, attends to embodiment and disrupts enchantments. So Richard, you're going to be the host for this evening's event. Welcome and thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and welcome everybody. There's a few familiar names there, and so we're going to have we've got about an hour together, and the way that we're going to do it is that I'm going to be chatting with Corinne for a bit, and I'm sure as we're talking, a few bits and pieces interesting points will come up where you might like to ask some questions and things like that. If you've got points or questions, what we'd like you to do is stick those in the chat, which is at the bottom of your screen there. And between us, and that includes Andrew, we'll try to spot them and pick up questions and see how it goes. So I'm going to introduce Corinne, and I'm going to take my introduction from the jacket of her book, which was in the background there from Our Island Stories, was in the background of Andrew's piece. And we're going to kind of build the conversation around that book, but also I'm going to say a little bit about a book that I contributed to, which kind of connects into that as well. And that's Breaking the Dead Silence, and that's also on the Walk, Listen, Create website if you want to have a look at it. So introducing Corinne. Corinne's a professor of colonialism and heritage in museum studies at the University of Leicester. Between 2018 and 2022, Corinne directed a child-led history and writing project called Colonial Countryside, National Trust Houses Reinterpreted. And for those of you that are based in the West Country of England, some of the places that might come up are based around here. She also co-authored the 2020 National Trust report on its country houses, historical links to the British Empire, for which, you know, Corinne, my heart went out when this was going on. You got a real drubbing from the media, and I hope we kind of out the other side of that and can kind of these conversations and the sort of work towards truth and honesty can continue and progress. This book, Our Island Stories, isn't the only thing that's kind of out there. There's this wonderful book, Green and Unpleasant Land, highly recommended, particularly for writers and kind of referencing writers and poets and things like that who have interpreted in different ways Britain's colonial countryside. So how's that does that cover your space, Corinne? I'm not.
Yeah, pretty thorough.
Great. So we got your face up. I had Andrew's screen there for a moment. So why don't we just sort of kick off with give us a sort of a little overview of the book, and the theme that I'd like to kind of begin with, sort of pick up with, is you finish it with a sort of a lovely Star Trek-y kind of reference. I don't know, Space Final Frontier kind of thing, but you talked about, you said you hope that the book will inspire other countryside walks beyond Britain's final frontier of belonging. So maybe let's start there and give us a bit of an overview of the book, but that kind of thought about belonging and walking and belonging.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good way in. I think I write about the countryside, and I write about the countryside's connection to the British Empire, which is very varied across different periods and in different places of the UK. And I was interested in bringing out the unique colonial connections of 10 different places in the UK. But I finished the book that way because I think the countryside has always been a bit of a contested space, and there's a bit of historically a bit of a tussle of ideas about what the countryside represents to different people who are differently positioned to land ownership or power. You might be landless and be writing all those anti-pastoral poems, you know, about thinking a bit more critically about the landscape as not just a kind of idyllic retreat from the city and or the urban place. And I suppose the countryside, as I discussed in my previous book that you held out, Green Unpleasant Land, you know, I was talking a lot there about um, how the countryside has been viewed in terms of who is seen traditionally or conventionally to naturally belong to the countryside and who isn't. Um, and so one of the things that I think I've wanted in my work to open up a little bit is the colonial and post-colonial history of rural Britain. And that includes the historical Black presence, which I refer to a lot in my new book, in places like Whitehaven on the Cumbrian coast, as I argue in that book, used to be more multicultural than they are perhaps today. And we've forgotten those things, and we can have a much more nuanced view of historically of British history as well in its connection to empire. So I tried to choose 10 different places, which were mostly chosen by my fellow walkers, actually. You know, I walked together with other people to open up those histories, but also the people I walked with are people I know or people I've worked with and whose work I admire, who I think are inspiring, just generally inspiring human beings who you can have a great conversation with about colonial history and what it means at a human level, what it means to them personally. And so a lot of my places were chosen by them. And what surprised me when I was writing this book was how incredibly fertile this topic is. You can pretty much put a pin in any part of the map of Britain and you're going to find a new colonial story pop up. It's not very difficult to find, and it's not rocket science to find it either. I think it's just that we haven't always thought about that aspect of colonial history and how the influx of imperial wealth, money from slavery or East India Company profits or whatever those profits were, how was that money spent and how did that impact on local rural life? You know, whether that was through enclosure and expansion of country estates, the purchase of country estates, or the building of village schools, or you know, whatever it was. There's a lot of very interesting stories that pop up when you
Really,
look at the countryside through that lens.
really, and I think it comes out of the book so well, and I think that's what walking does. You know, that I've my own practice kind of, I'm working with a thing that I've come from. It's not an original thing, but just that idea of walking and asking questions. You know, why is that tree there? Why is that hedge there? How's that come to be? And you know, you're right. You start to kind of, you know, I suppose there are places where it's blindingly obvious. So around the big cities and Liverpool and Bristol and London and all of that. But as you kind of go out to what you now think of as picturesque England or Britain's green and pleasant land kind of thing, you start to see those. For me, the book kind of helps kind of focus that lens of sensing the land ownership stuff that's manifested in trees or walls or buildings or whatever. And I thought that's a really interesting element. One of the things you say, you talk about it, as kind of landscape, as kind of contested space, that you walked in the Lake District with Ingrid Pollard, whose work I love. And, I remember those, so show me age, I suppose, but there were big billboard posters that she did, which were kind of like it's like an old school picture postcard, but it showed her as a black walker with a family, I think, sitting and having a picnic and things like that. And there was a real sort of, there's a visual challenge there. Now I'm not familiar with, so it was, Zakia Soul, who you walked with in Norfolk. And so you walked with, so for benefit of people who haven't read the book, each of the walks, apart from one, is a walk with another artist, writer, thinker, person. And I thought there was a real kind of that idea, going back to that idea of belonging, whereas Ingrid, I feel, and maybe it's the product of the time, but there was a very much, she's kind of claiming, I have a right to be here. Yeah. Whereas Zakia, it was something about her, you're showing her some really quite, horrific stuff. You're showing her some quite kind of difficult juxtapositions around wealth derived from the labour of enslaved people, and how that was used in terms of enclosures. And she's almost kind of sort of stepping back into a deeper or a more ancient kind of engagement with the countryside and landscape. Do you want to kind of riff around those two differences?
Yeah, I think that's a great contrast to draw out, because Ingrid Pollard, as you rightly said, I mean, first of all, she did a series of postcards called Pastoral Interlude, and that was photographs of largely herself sitting in the landscape in the Lake District and kind of claiming that space, saying, I walk here, I come here with my friends, I have for decades, here I am. And she had a caption in one of those, which was, I wandered lonely as a cloud amongst a sea of white faces. I think that's the caption of one of them. So she has long been exploring race and the countryside and these so-called hidden histories of the Black presence. But also she used to say to me, well, I just want to sneak my postcards into one of these postcard racks in the Lake District, just so that there is a representation of people like me who walk here all the time. Thank you very much, and have done for ages. So, and then there was the Wordsworth postcard that you mentioned that she also made, which was, I think it was called Wordsworth History and Heritage, and she took photographs of herself and her friends walking through the Lake District, and on a Wordsworthian theme. And again, she's been interested in Wordsworth for a while, because there are mentions in his sister Dorothy's diaries of Black people walking through Grasmere and knocking on the door, and also in the poetry of Wordsworth himself. So that was, really, really interesting. And when I asked Ingrid, what do you think of Wordsworth? Because that walk is called My Opium Walk. And that, it traces the opium story of the Wordsworth family and how they tried but failed to make money from opium through the East India Company, very lucrative trade networks. But when I asked her what she thought of Wordsworth, she said, well, I feel a bit indifferent to Wordsworth. In a way, I'm not really very interested. I am, but I'm not. And she said the same about Beatrix Potter. She said, they just dominate the narrative of the landscape, you know, of the Lake District landscape and the national park. It's all about Beatrice Potter and William Wordsworth. There's nothing else is of really, you know, real importance or interest. So I think she felt that a bit oppressed by those figures, because they just kind of define the narrative. Saki is a much younger walker. She was the youngest person I walked with, and she is a broadcaster and DJ based in London. And she did a brilliant series. I don't know if anyone's heard it. And she did a lot of walking in that as well, and quite a lot of atmospheric conversations. And it was called My Albion, her series on BBC Radio 4. And I wanted to walk with her because she said, well, what she had focused on so far was the countryside's and nature's potential for healing. You know, the fact that it is potentially a very healing space, and it's a space for well-being. It's a space where you can reflect on things, you can feel better if something bad's happened to you. You can work things out in your mind as you slow down and walk at a nice steady pace. And she, you know, she's been interested in that for a while, but at the same time there is always this background challenge, you know, that the countryside isn't as inclusive as we would like it to be, even though there are people of colour living and working in the countryside and have been for a long time. They don't seem visible in one way. You know, they massively contribute to rural economies, but they don't seem to feature in the way that maybe Ingrid Pollard was suggesting in narratives about that place and contributions to that place. But in any case, she had focused, like you say, on folk history and in a way pre-colonial, pre-literate social practices and customs, myths, legends, all these kind of magic things associated with magic and mystery and all of that, and paganism, all of these things she's been, folklore, she's been interested in for ages, and the kind of wisdom of that, and also a time when we all lived a bit closer to the earth. And of course, walking is a brilliant way of reconnecting with nature. But some of those places that we walk through, I sort of wanted to discuss with her, well, what about colonial history? And, you know, do you feel ready to think about the connections between slavery and the Norfolk, the Norfolk landscape? And she said, yeah, she did feel ready for it. So we went to explore that together around Ersham Hall, and we would, like you say, the history is quite disturbing in some ways, because the land around Ersham Hall, which is on the Norfolk-Suffolk border, was expanded and enclosed with slavery wealth of more than one person, actually. And if you place the enclosure records next to the legacies of British slave ownership database, where you can see who owned which plantations, you can see how that money was spent on land. And so I suppose, yeah, we discussed a little bit about, you know, how that might affect your relationship with the countryside. If you know those things, you know, you're seeking solace in the countryside and companionship and connection with nature and all of those things. But does it kind of sully your relationship with nature? But in many ways, it's such a brilliant opportunity to contemplate, you know, past ways of thinking, in terms of the perhaps the colonial moving into the industrial kind of industrializing mindset of, you know, the land must be productive, the land must be improved, as they said, you know, throw people off the common land and improve it by grazing sheep and fencing it all off and all of that stuff, and you know, make the land productive. But as we know, that has a, you know, that has a lot of problems
Yeah.
associated with it. And when, you know, there's this whole conversation going on about all the species that are becoming extinct because of what that led to, which was
Yeah.
intensive farming and pesticides and all of those things. So I think that you can make quite productive connections, for example, between, um, you know, a certain attitude to land, which follows whatever, which does whatever it does, you know, the kind of rewilding conversation, and which used to, in the colonial period, in the period of enclosure, be called, you know, wasteland, because it was unproductive. The way of
Mhm.
seeing it was not how we might more productively think about it now.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I think
And
we're talking about all these sorts of things. It brings up loads of resonant themes, I think.
mhm. And I think you can see, so the walking that I've been doing here in North Somerset recently, um,
Mm,
very much informed by a little bit of research time that I had in South
mm,
Australia, and you can see how in the same period as the the compensation money was being paid out to slave owners, and that kind of business model of the plantation was sort of really kind of falling apart,
yes.
and they were kind of getting out. Where they were going was exporting the same thing, so that
Mm,
that attitude towards not just fellow human beings, but the attitude towards the land, the whole kind of idea of terra nullius in Australia, that
yeah,
it's the same as the way that they were describing common land as wasteland, unproductive land,
yeah.
and all of that. Um, and it's really interesting that it's, again, I can't speak for Norfolk, but in this part of the world, it's the same people that pop up who then become the poor law guardians, and
Mm,
it's the
mm,
same kind of set of attitudes and ways of seeing poor people, which is
yeah,
racialized, I suppose, when it's then taken to the colonized places.
100%. Yeah.
Um, there's a question. Is it walking? Yeah, okay. So there's a question from Andrew about walking with others,
Mm,
and so picking that one through about, because the last walk you do on your own, the rest of it is you're walking with other individuals, and
mm,
so I'd like to kind of extend that a bit, but because it's about it, I'd like to get you to see what you think about walking in that kind of convivial way with other people,
mm,
but also it's something about sharing a space with another human body, and how
mm,
that kind of manifested in the walk experience. So the times you talk about stopping for a drink or getting a cup of tea or catching a bus,
mm,
that
mm,
kind of thing, that kind of convivial aspect of walking in these particular places with those particular themes. So it's sort of this is there are you looking out for each other? There was at one point where it was the walk in Scotland, where I sort of felt that you kind of bottled out challenging the man about his forebears. That you kind of look after each other in a way. Maybe we won't get into that difficulty. I don't know. What like just your thoughts there?
yeah. Well, I think that the context behind this book, I need to sort of rewind just slightly, because when I did the National Trust report, that was just an audit of published peer-reviewed research about country houses and their connections to empire. So it wasn't any new research. It was just putting together in one place all the research that was published so far. But we did find ourselves in the middle of Britain's first modern culture war, and it was a pretty rocky and prolonged experience of, yeah, media abuse and readers of the newspapers very triggered, and then writing angry emails and threatening letters and all that. So one of the things I did during that time was, when I had the energy or resource, I used to answer some of the angry emails and letters that I got, because I felt that it was better to connect than to disconnect, and that this can become really divisive. And I wanted to understand why people were so upset or angry or triggered by it. Because I myself have colonial history in my family, a slavery history, but I don't feel that way about talking about it. So I sort of wanted to try and understand what was going on, and why people were upset or angry. And what I realized from those many exchanges that I had was that people calm down pretty quickly when you reach out to them and show them kind of unconditional respect. Because I think that, you know, if someone writes you a sweary email, it probably doesn't seem like the best idea to respond, but actually it can be a bit of a revelation. And so I realized from all of those exchanges that culture wars are completely unnecessary and divisive, and could have been avoided with better leadership. They can be avoided if we receive information more calmly and don't tell people to be hysterical about it. Or, you know, there are a lot of bad faith actors trying to stir up division and trouble, and it's really unhelpful. So I wanted a book where it was about conversation and not shouting, and about connecting with each other rather than disconnecting, but also connecting with nature. And so, yeah, I might be writing about some unpleasant histories, but I do it with a love of nature, and a kind of a desire to enjoy it in the company, convivially, as you say, with somebody else who I respect and admire, and who I find inspiring. So I think it was a great opportunity to do that. But I also think walking is quite good for research, because yeah, I mean, you can talk about what the history means, what it means at a human level, which is really important. What, you know, rather than just seeing it as a collection of interesting facts, you know, why does it matter? What's at stake? What's the legacy of that? What's the harm done? And how can we address these things? All of those happen best, I think, in conversation, considered, calm conversation with others who are differently positioned in relation to that history. I think it can be really productive. But walking itself is brilliant for research, because you come across things in a grounded way that you wouldn't be able to come across just by looking in an archive or reading a book. I think, for example, when I was doing the Bankers' Walk through Hampshire, I came across an enormous, ridiculously enormous church in a little hamlet, which I thought, why is that church so enormous? And then I realised it was built by the Baring family, who made about a third of their money from cotton produced by enslaved people, or investing in financing plantations in Louisiana, things like that. And I realised that church was built by the Barings family. So, you know, I wouldn't, and it's called the Cathedral of the Valley because it's so disproportionate in size, so ostentatious. You know, given where it actually is, at the edge of this tiny, you couldn't even call it a hamlet. I almost can't call it a hamlet. And so these things are really useful. And I often mention the fact that little village churches are also helpful, because for anyone can look in them, look at the memorials around the walls, and you nearly always find a reference to some colonial history, someone who's died in the, you know, the Anglo-Afghan War, or something like this. You will always find something, or someone who's funded the church, you know, was an East India Company official. There is sometimes there, sometimes evaded, but it's there. So so I think that's useful.
Yeah, there's also walking is incredible. You know, you kind of there's something about being in the zone, and you hit a serendipity of things. Like there's the walk where there was a head of an owl You know, I just that
Yeah.
you walk past that really sort of macabre kind of from nowhere, but what that then does is it rattles through what you're reading, and I'm thinking, I'm reading the words and I'm thinking about this owl head. Well, what was that? Was that a nasty gamekeeper? Like they used to string up rats and things. What was that all about?
Yeah.
Staying with the walking, so folks out there, there's some nice interesting comments coming up, and we'll come to them in a moment. We're sort of about 2/3 through now, I think. But staying with the walking, I wonder what are your what I say for me then, what's important for me is actually it's the embodied activity of walking. It's like you start to think with your whole body, not just with your head. And once you're maybe sort of 3, 4, 5 miles in, it becomes a whole body experience. So you know, your feet are telling you stuff, and your eyes are telling you stuff, and your ears are tuned in, and all of that. And I wonder, because sometimes and again, it's walking in Norfolk, there starts to be a bit of a conversation from Zakia, and again, I'm interested how it came about, but starting to talk about inherited trauma. And I just, you know, what are your thoughts on just that process, which is about a moving, sensing body, and what comes out, what goes through that, and your thoughts around that in those walks?
Yeah, 100%. So I think what Zakia was talking about in that walk was that um, um, the trauma of slavery is very much unprocessed across the generations. You know, unless every generation had psychotherapists working them through the nightmare that was, and all of the consequences, that it can be, that kind of pain and trauma can be passed on a bit like a baton from one generation to another. And there's something very restorative about being in nature and being embodied, because the trauma is felt in the body, not just in the mind. And you have to kind of deal with both, I think. Zakia Sewell is somebody who is just asking who's Zakia. She's a DJ and broadcaster that I walked with through Norfolk. And I think, you know, we got so much benefit from walking through that landscape together and also sitting in it. You know, while we were talking about all of that trauma, this big hare burst across the field. And, you know, we both stopped and kind of oohed and ahed over it in a way that it gives you a sort of thrill. It gives you a moment of joy. But I suppose that's not enjoying the countryside and getting its well-being benefits is a bit, it's not unproblematic for everyone, because I mean, at the moment I'm involved in as a co-investigator with Neil Chakrabarty, who's an expert in rural racism, and it's called the Rural Racism Project. And we're having 100 conversations with people of colour about their experience of living in or visiting the countryside. And the kinds of experiences that they've had of racism sort of vary from out and out direct, really obvious stuff, to much more subtle stuff, you know, always being asked, well, why are you here? Where are you from? You know, these sort of things that make them feel a bit too visible, as if they're an exception to the norm. And therefore it's not that relaxing if people keep, you know, looking at you or asking you searching questions, or, you know, just responding to you differently than they might respond to someone who you know, looks like most people who are in the countryside. And I suppose it's just that, really, that it interferes potentially. That's why I called the countryside a kind of final frontier of belonging. If you look at, we've got some case studies on our rural racism project, and one of them is the Muslim hikers, who receive the most unbelievable abuse for just having a Muslim hikers group, because one of the things is that if people aren't used to going out in the countryside, they might feel a bit conspicuous or over visible, and it might, one way of easing people in is to have a familiar group where they feel kind of safe and secure, and part of a group, so therefore um, a bit more relaxed. And loads of people have said online things like, they're perpetuating racism by having their own group, that they're actually being racist by not joining existing groups. And there's this assumption that existing groups would be absolutely fine about a group of Muslims joining them. Maybe some would, maybe some wouldn't. And so there's a lot of, and then also saying that they're, enemies of Britain, that they need to blend in, all this kind of, that they don't belong there, they don't know how to walk through the countryside, they damage the countryside. There's a lot of abuse, a high volume of it. That's just one of many, many examples. But I think it's just just trying to promote a more inclusive countryside is something we can all do more consciously. And what people ask for a lot, who are skeptical that racism exists in the countryside, or that somehow you're picking on people in the countryside as being more racist than people in the city. But it's not that. It's just that the studies show that racism is a little bit more intensively directed in the countryside than it is in the city. And that that we've got plenty of evidence, so we just keep, we just collected it, because I think people just, it's like, oh well, we won't believe it till we see it, so we just collected the evidence. And the worst affected seem to be children of color who grow up in these little village schools, who get bullied, or called names, or told that they're quite attractive for a black child. This kind of really disturbing stuff that really bothers, would really bother you. Just an over intensive gaze, at the very least, and much worse at the worst. So I think that's kind of why I mentioned that final frontier of belonging. We could be more inclusive, or should be, ideally, more inclusive.
Should be. And I would, as a white man, and on the whole, most of the people who walk with me on the kind of the walks that I do, sort of month on month, it tends to be older white people. There's a kind of responsibility there, which is about our privilege, and it's about acknowledging that privilege and working through that privilege, I think. And that sort of that sense kind of informs both the walking and also the kind of the topics that I'm sort of seeking to investigate, because what I feel that you're hitting is a kind of, it's that white fragility. We don't want to talk about it. I'm not going to go into details, but there's an estate near here that I've been trying to kind of walk through, where the owners of that estate, the moment that I said, oh, well, I've just written part of a book that was about what happened after the Colston statue came down, and it was like, well, I shouldn't have used the C word there, because it was literally, you could it was almost, you could hear the mental doors shut, and that we don't want to talk about it. It's all about the future, everything to do with the future. What we're doing here, it's not about the past. Past is over. And as we well know, you've just got to look at the landscape, that the past is manifest in the landscape. By understanding the past, we can understand the present. That's what we're all about.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, one example of that, sorry, before you, probably we've got questions to answer, but one of the fascinating aspects of that is, where I am now. I'm actually speaking from Devon. I live in Birmingham, but I'm at an estate which is actually a retreat centre, because I'm doing some work with them. And it's called Sharpham Estate, and it's got a very direct colonial history that they are interested in not just acknowledging, but addressing in really creative, interesting ways. And their history is basically that the house was bought with the proceeds of a ship that was captured full of Peruvian silver and gold, which was owned by the Spanish. It was a Spanish colonial ship. And the reward on that bounty, you know, was £60,000 in the 18th century. And that money was then spent on landscaping a beautiful estate around me, which is now a retreat centre, and the house itself. So very, very direct connection. But one of the fascinating things about this place really speaks to what you say about the ongoing legacy of colonialism, which we could address really productively, which is that trees were removed in order to build wooden ships for the Navy to fight their colonial and other wars, and for slave ships. And that was a deforestation that, you know, there's now a rewilding project going on here and some tree planting going on. But I think that you can look at it quite productively and think forwards, not just say, oh, that was in the past and it doesn't have any impact now. I mean, it absolutely does have an impact. Land ownership is one of the biggest legacies of colonialism in the countryside, large-scale land ownership of land that was bought with slavery wealth or colonial wealth of one kind or another, some kind of profits from the empire.
Yeah, I think the story of the enclosures and kind of bringing that out into much more wider consciousness is a really urgent thing, and it's such a huge thing. It's really difficult to find a way into it, but it is absolutely, when people say, oh, this stuff happened a long, you know, way from here, distant lands and all the rest of it, but the, you know, the upheaval and the, you know, it comes back here in two ways. It comes back here in wealth, but it also comes back in people being cleared off the land.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I noticed that somebody had written, they mentioned Guy Shrubsole, who's just written a new book, which I read in advance and wrote a little endorsement for. And I think there's Who Owns Britain, but there's a new one, and it's all about private land ownership, and it's absolutely fascinating because what he's really interested in is busting the myth that private landowners are the best custodians of the land rather than the public. And I think that it's a really important myth to explode, and he gives several horrifying examples of why private landowners are not necessarily the best custodians and why communal ownership might be a way forward, because that would be a kind of reversal of the loss of the commons with enclosure and so on. So I think there's a lot of work, really, really interesting work that could be done. It just needs thinking through with more sympathetic landowners, or you know, it's some kind of future, thinking about the future.
And yeah, for us to walk it. So we're getting near to having to call time. So we've just picked up on so I'm looking at the comments now. We picked up on the Guy Shrubsole thing, and another, I guess that's also a book reference. I'm not familiar with it. Anita Setti's I Belong Here. But further up, there was a question about countryside. So everybody out there that's watching, we're going to be wrapping up fairly soon. So if you've got a question or a point that you'd like to make, now is the time to do it. The question on the comments here is, why do we tend to assume the countryside is natural, eternal, and unchanged? How long-standing is that idea, or when was it constructed? You've got a thought on that one?
Yeah, I'd have to think about it a little bit to give a more precise answer, but I think a lot of the constructedness of the landscape was looked at by that brilliant historian of the landscape, Hoskins,
Mm.
and he talked a lot about how the countryside it basically shows the history. It bears the marks of human habitation and different phases of human habitation, whether that's the kind of the ditches in places like Norfolk and other wetlands, or whether that's I suppose the sort of depleted post-industrial landscapes, or the hedges and fields, of course, which are very much a remnant of enclosure across many centuries. But I think that what I talked about in a previous book is the pastoral tradition of writing, which I'm sure a lot of you will be very familiar with, which is really it kind of adds to that sense of the countryside as an idyll, as a retreat, as something wholly natural, not constructed. There is an anti-pastoral tradition which really pushes back against that, but it goes, all of that poetry and rural writing, which belongs to the pastoral tradition, it goes right back to ancient ideas of Arcadia and the kind of shepherds talking to each other about love and nature, you know, in peaceful surroundings with lutes and, you know, all this kind of idyllic stuff.
Yeah.
So
But
it goes back a long way.
It does, but I kind of throw in a thing to do there with it, which is about a kind of a literate Enlightenment tradition that kind of picked up on all of that and kind of sanitized it, and so that you kind of the looking back on England's green and pleasant land and the checker book of little fields and all of that and everything else is, that feels to me that's a kind of a late 18th century 19th century kind of construction, that is that what sits behind it is some kind of white supremacy. You know, that's what they were exporting. They took the like to Adelaide, where I was, for instance, they, you know, there were country houses built like as if they were in Somerset. You know, they took the songbirds out there, they took the grass out there, you know, and that's
it's a kind of a sort of propaganda in a way, maybe. But
so,
I think also, maybe just, you know, what you said about romanticism is really important, because the romantic ideal of the landscape and of nature in particular, you know, which Wordsworth was, of course, at the centre of, it was also a reaction against industrialization and the, you know, the factory chimneys, the factory system, you know, the kind of ugliness and things that made you shudder about those kinds of developments and oppressions that were associated with them. And so nature was a way of, you know, of reconnecting with the spiritual, with the self, with something that was honest and true and natural and all of that. So I think probably 18th century was key.
Yeah. So I think we're back into that same space now with the rewilding and the well-being and all of that. There's a kind of bourgeoisie wanting to have their cake and eat it, I think, and sort of squishing that up. So we've got very few moments left. So a question from Babak says, you mentioned working on 100 conversations with immigrants, question mark. What's the platform that you'll use for distribution of that? And then there's a further point from Hilda. Thank you.
Well, we're going to write a trade book about it, so it will be sort of out there. But we haven't written it yet. We're just analysing our results, our data. But it's based at the Centre for Hate Studies, and it's a Leverhulme funded project. So there will be 3 reports which we will publish, sort of showing our findings and our evidence base, and then we'll be writing a book together, you know, discussing our findings and the implications for a more inclusive rural policy going forward.
Right, I look forward to that. I think that's, I can't tell this, we have no time for the story, but the only walk of yours that in the book that I've done is the walk along the Drax Estate wall to Tolpuddle. I used to go to Tolpuddle every year, and although I'm a white man walking, that experience of rural racism was absolutely what I grew up in, and even amongst people who you would think were, you know, good humanitarian socialists, that kind of the racism in the well, certainly back then the trade union movement was quite significant.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to say a big thank you to Corinne and Richard for keeping us entertained over the last 45, 50 minutes, and not just entertained, but made us start thinking differently about the countryside through which probably many of us have walked and never really fully considered about its history or how it came to be. So thanks very much for that. Okay, so thanks everybody for coming. We hope to see you in the coming weeks. As I say, do sign up to our weekly newsletter. Do come along and see us again another time. A really big thank you, Corinne. And I'm really glad you were able to come back and see us again, even though we postponed the December event. And it was a really good chat. And the reason why it was a really good chat was we had a really good host as well. Much better than I would. Much better than I would. But you get the last word, Corinne.
Oh, well, oh yeah, I suppose my last word is there are maps of all the walks, so you can do the walks yourself.
Brilliant.
Feel free to contact me for the OS references. I'm on email. You can look me up, Corinne Fowler, on email. You'll find it.
Everyone, thanks very much for supporting us and especially supporting Corinne. Great. Thanks again.